If this is your first time using a film camera, this is a short guide on how to use the Canon AV-1 35mm SLR from 1979. It's similar to the more popular AE-1, but uses aperture priority instead of shutter priority and is not capable of fully manual exposure. Canon FD lenses can be attached like this. Dozens of FD lenses are available, and this is an example of a zoom lens from 70 to 210mm, but it's quite clunky, so I wouldn't recommend it. Before mounting the lens, make sure the aperture ring is not set to the A mark on the aperture scale. This camera will not function unless the battery is loaded, so I would recommend using these, which you can get off Amazon, but they are quite rare. You can check the power level of the battery by looking into the viewfinder while pressing the battery check button on the top of the camera. When the battery check button is pressed, the meter needle in the viewfinder swings up, and the condition of the battery depends on where the meter needle comes to rest according to the chart, which you can see here. When the camera is not in use, the lock lever should always be in the L position to prevent battery consumption and film wastage by accidental shutter release. When the shutter release button is pressed lightly only halfway, the camera's meter turns on and gives a reading inside the viewfinder. Once the shutter has been released, the film advance lever can be advanced. To advance it, first lightly push it away from the camera body to its 30-degree standoff position. So this is how you would go about loading the film. This is probably one of the easiest film cameras to load because it has a multi-slot take-up spool. You're going to want to take one blank shot. Once the back is closed, you need to take two more blank shots, turning the film advance lever and releasing the shutter so that the frame counter advances from S to 0. While doing this, keep an eye on the rewind knob. If it rotates, the film is properly loaded, but if it doesn't, unfold the rewind crank and turn it again gently in the direction of the arrow to take up possible slack. If it doesn't rotate, open the back cover and reload the film. Each film has a film speed, which is usually stated as ASA or ISO. These values can be found on the film packaging. The film speed must be set on the camera or your pictures will not be exposed correctly. The selector dial has 5 settings. For normal photography, this dial must be set to A. The dial automatically locks in this position, which allows automatic flash photography with Canon speed lights. The other positions on the dial are all for special uses. The total amount of light allowed to strike the film is controlled by the aperture and the shutter speed. But since this camera is an aperture priority camera, you set the aperture while the camera will automatically select the shutter speed for correct exposure. The aperture is an opening formed by diaphragm blades inside the lens. Each size aperture is given a numerical value called an f number or f-stop. You can find these numbers on the lens aperture scale. The numbers on the scale differ according to the lens. If you want to make your subject stand out by blurring the foreground and background, use a large f-stop, such as f2.8. If you want the foreground and background to be in good focus, choose a small f-stop, such as f11. If your subject is moving and you wish to prevent blur, generally choose a large f-stop, such as f4. So when you look into the viewfinder, on the extreme right is a scale with shutter speeds from 1/1000th of a second to 2 seconds. All solid black numbers are reciprocals of the real shutter speed, so that 500, for instance, stands for a shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. Only the black outline 2 at the bottom of the scale is a whole number standing for 2 seconds. If the meter needle points to the red index at the top or bottom of the shutter speed scale when the shutter button is pressed halfway, exposure will be incorrect. If the f-stop is set to the largest one and it is underexposed, then you're going to have to use a flash or add light or use a film with a higher ASA rating. If it's set to the smallest f-stop and it's overexposed, you'll have to attach an ND filter or use a film with a lower ASA rating. It's important to remember that camera shake can ruin your picture with blur. Although the best precaution preventing camera shake is to press the shutter release button gently, it's also helpful to hold the camera properly. Grip the camera firmly in both hands with some right fingers on the finger grip and with the left hand supporting the lens. The meter needle is currently positioned at the camera shake warning index. If it is on it or below it, choose a larger f-stop or use a flash. The AV-1 has 3 focusing aids, and this diagram indicates when your photograph would be in focus. To rewind the film, you're going to have to press this button. Then you do this. The AV-1 has several special functions, such as a self-timer setting. You can also prevent lighting problems by using the backlight control switch, which will automatically reduce the shutter speed by 1.5 steps to increase exposure. You must keep pressing this switch until after you press the shutter release button. It doesn't lock. And if you wish to give more or less exposure than the backlight control switch permits, you can change the ASA. For instance, if you have ASA 200 film loaded and you wish to overexpose the image for a backlit situation, simply set the film speed dial to ASA 100. If you are going to use a self-timer setting, remember to place the viewfinder cover over the eyepiece. Otherwise, light entering the viewfinder through the eyepiece may cause underexposure. Aperture priority cameras give you control over the depth of field, which is the area in front of and behind the subject which is in focus at the same time as the subject. The smaller the f-stop, the greater the depth of field. It must be remembered that the aperture will also have a great effect on shutter speed. For some shots, the shutter speed which corresponds to the aperture you've selected might not be suitable. For example, faster moving subjects require correspondingly higher shutter speeds if you don't want the photo to be blurred. Simply turn the aperture ring to a larger f-stop to raise the shutter speed. Finally, if you wish to take photos at night, there is a bulb setting on the selector dial, which lets you make exposures longer than the slowest shutter speed of 2 seconds. The shutter will remain open as long as you press the shutter release button. You can of course also use a flashlight, as I have done here. So that's all there is to know if you want to start using aperture priority film cameras such as the Canon AV-1. Thank you for watching.